Well, just to double down on what Susan said, I am personally very happy to be here tonight with Ido. You don't want my bag? It goes with any outfit.
That's a good line. That's a good line.
He is a true intellectual, and he's been a profoundly important and articulate advocate for Israel in this assignment. And even though he and I sometimes disagree, we have always been able to discuss issues in a very respectful way. So I appreciate that as a personal thing. So, all about you. What's been your biggest challenge? What was your biggest challenge here in this appointment?
Well, diplomacy by definition is about building relationships. This is a change from the original definition of diplomacy that was shaped many, many years ago as a form of advocacy or even litigation on behalf of your nation, advocating a certain policy. And the shift from advocacy to relationship building is a very challenging one, especially in the age of information revolution, which I believe is perhaps the most dramatic revolution in recent history. And we are living through those very, very fateful days. The world is changing in front of our eyes. And the only constant thing, the only permanent, is change. And how do you cope with that? If you're a government, any government, how do you cope with that when you are an institution? So my biggest challenge was to educate and galvanize and mobilize people to embrace that change from a system of advocacy and endless debates to a system of building bridges and relationships. There's two different worlds.
That's sort of theoretical. Can you bring it down to something particular?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Usually and we started doing that after 9/11. We actually, after 9/11, we realized that something of biblical proportions had just happened. And we wanted to know how this event is going to affect the positioning of Israel in the world. So what we did, we embarked on a study. And in that study, we asked people, when you say the word Israel, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And in North America, and later we discovered that also in large parts of Europe, when you say Israel, the first thing that comes to mind, understandably, is conflict, bloodshed, tension, danger, and the color is red. So we said to ourselves, okay, we recognize the fact we have issues in Israel. We have problems, right? We live in a very unstable neighborhood. We have our own challenges. We deal with security issues day in and day out. But is it really the only thing that defines us? Are we just about conflict? It's very similar to the situation New York City faced in the 70s, when it was synonymous with crime and police corruption. And the question that people asked is this really who we are? Are we only about crime? Don't we have more than crime to offer the world? And so New York embarked on this strategic long-term effort to broaden the conversation about New York. They also effectively dealt with the problem of crime, of course. And the practical example that I would use is, of course, my efforts to broaden the conversation about Israel so that Israel will not become synonymous with its problems and conflict and bloodshed, because Israel is way more than just a conflict. It's a real place with real people, with real achievement, with real accomplishment.
And apart from, say, going to a group like this and talking about that, though, how were you able to implement that? So
I'll give you a couple of examples. We're very proud.
Were you successful? How do you feel you've been successful at changing that conversation?
Well, I can't brag about myself or my staff. I can tell you it's never the work of one person. And I was lucky, and I still am lucky, and the state of Israel is lucky to have so many friends here in New York. One of the things that I learned after working in New York for many, many years is that in New York, Israel is a local story. And if you're willing to work hard, the sky's the limit. Everything is accessible to you. If you want to represent Israel in New York, even with people that disagree with you, there is a basis for cooperation. So it's not about politics all the time. There's certain things that transcend beyond politics. So I'll give you a couple of examples of things that we did I'm very proud of. State of Israel is the only country outside of the United States that I know of that is officially recognizing, the Israeli legislator and the Israeli embassies all over the world, and especially here in New York, Martin Luther King Day. So we established an award that we give out every year to a prominent African American who has a connection to Israel. And it could be an NBA star, like Ellen Houston. It could be a politician, like Hakeem Jeffries. It could be a member of the clergy, like A.R. Bernard or Reverend Jacques de Graaf, or an entertainer like Gloria Gaynor, who was the recipient of the award last year. I'll give you another example. Very important for us to establish ties with the Latino community. Why? Because we want the Latinos to know that we are interested in building a relationship with them, not because we want them to support our position on the conflict. We want them to understand who we are. This is our job as diplomats. We want to promote and advance the interests of our nation. You do that by building relationships. So instead of making an appeal to them based on our advocating our policies, which I don't believe is going to be of interest to them because we ask them and we know this is not what they care about, we try to understand what is it that they do care about. And we discovered that the Latinos in the Northeast care deeply about the situation in Puerto Rico. So we said, how can we in Israel be of help to Puerto Rico? So the first thing that we did, we went to Puerto Rico and we tried to assess their needs. So we discovered, for example, that despite the fact that Puerto Rico is surrounded by water, they have a real problem with water. So we introduced them to Israeli water technology companies. And then only last week, we put together a seminar that was meant to attract investors to Puerto Rico. And the people that were invited to the seminar were Israeli investors and members of the Jewish community, many of them interested in making an investment in Puerto Rico and its future. The secretary in charge of commerce and industry came from Puerto Rico to represent the opportunities. And we had 80 people in the room. The keynote speaker was Howard Lutnick, CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, who lost 658 of his own employees during 9/11 out of 900 employees. Today, he rebuilt the company to 10,000 people strong. And he gave the most inspirational talk about how you recover from crisis. And it was really inspiring. And so that's the kind of stuff that we're engaged in. Another initiative we're very proud of is the conference Beyond. Beyond is a conference that features speakers that talk about how Israel inspired them. And again, they're not there to pitch any political view. They're not there to pitch any product or any agenda. They're there to share their own inspiring personal story. And that's very, very effective. And this conference is growing every year. And I can go on and on and on and give you examples of the kind of stuff that we produced here in New York that we believe really made a difference. It may not be a huge difference, but we started moving the needle a little bit.
You know, over the time that you've been here, there's been concern, at least in some areas, that there may be declining support among Americans in general for Israel. Sorry, because there's a mic there. Over the period that Ido has been here, there's been some concern in some quarters that there's declining support for Israel among Americans in general, and even declining support among some, American Jews, young American Jews in particular. Did you encounter that? And if you did, what kind of conversations did you have to try to reverse that?
Well, I think the whole conversation regarding the level of political support for Israeli policy is somewhat outdated. Let me explain why. Because in today's world, 2016, it's about the quality of the emotional tie that exists between people and places. So you have Israelis that are moving to Berlin. What does it mean? It means that they are moving to Berlin because they see Berlin as a place of opportunity. I'm talking about thousands of young Israelis that now moved to Berlin the last 10 years. We have thousands of Israelis, hundreds of Israeli companies are moving to New York. What does it mean? It means that Israelis see an opportunity in New York. Does it mean by the fact that they move to New York that they embrace all the policies of all the elected officials in New York? No. Does it mean that they embrace all the policies of all the elected officials in America? No. It means that they were able to develop a relationship with New York outside of the political discussion. So to me, having an historical perspective is always helpful. Let me give you some examples. In 1948, when the State of Israel was founded, only 17% of American Jews identified with the Zionist movement. The largest religious movement within Judaism did not recognize Israel's capital, Jerusalem, until 1996. And I have to tell you that today, when I joined the Foreign Service 25 years ago, national events held by Jewish organizations were attended by, let's say, if you were able to attract 5,000 people, it was a smashing success, right? If the GA, the General Assembly of the Jewish Federations, attracted 5,000 people, everybody said, wow, what a big success. Today, AIPAC is attracting 18,000 people. We just had the AJC in Washington, D.C., 3,000 people. The JNF is attracting 2,500 people every conference. So the level of participation is much higher. The level of organization is much higher. The amount of money that is being raised for Jewish and Israeli-related causes is much higher. In fact, when you look at every parameter, the community is much stronger. So the notion that there is less support today for Israel stems from a different reason, I believe, and that is the fact that Israel encourages an open debate. By the way, if you look at the Israelis, and I'm sure you do that because you read Israeli newspapers probably every day, you see there's a great deal of criticism in Israel. In fact, the Israelis are the most self-critical bunch of people in the whole world. That doesn't mean they don't support their nation. They have their own reservations, they have their own questions. Doesn't mean they don't love, they don't have an emotional tie to the place. So I make a distinction between how people feel about Israel and what people think about Israeli policies. These are two different questions. And in fact, I would add to that the last several winners in the Nobel Prize in economics, they won the prize because they were able to prove that people can live perfectly fine with a disconnect between the rational and the emotional. People can agree with you and dislike you and vice versa. People can like you and disagree with you.
Complicated world. Also, while you've been here, the Iran nuclear deal was signed and became, certainly in my lifetime, the most contentious political issue between Israel and the United States. How do you see that deal working? What do you think are the residual effects, on the relationship between Israel and the United States?
Well, I think the relationship between Israel and the United States will certainly thrive, and they have survived the disagreement. I don't like to use the word crisis. It was a disagreement. We've had disagreements before with our friends, and it's okay. It's like having disagreements within your own family. The problem that we had with the deal, and we still have with the deal, is that we believe that the deal addresses effectively maybe the issue of whether Iran will be able to produce that one particular bomb. But the deal does not address the core issue, which is the nature of the regime, and we've had those conversations before. We believe that the main problem with Iran is what they stand for, what they represent. And if today the question is whether they will have access to nuclear military capabilities, then tomorrow the question, God forbid, may be maybe they will have access to biological warfare or chemical warfare. The damage is done. The damage is done. What is the damage? The first is that Iran is legally given a pathway to a nuclear bomb to enough enriched uranium within 10 to 15 years. The idea of allowing them to enrich enough uranium, although it's not needed for energy purposes at all, we believe it's a bad idea Just when you look at the facts, it's a bad idea based on their track record. Without nuclear capabilities, look at what they're doing with conventional military capabilities. That's the first problem. The second problem is the regional impact. We understand that Iran's main issue is their regional standing. We get that. We understand that. But the fact that Iran, the largest player in the Shiite world and the foremost producer and promoter of terrorism and destabilization in the world, especially in the Middle East, we believe that the fact that they were given legally access, pathway to enough enriched uranium is going to first turn them into an untouchable player in the region. It's not good news for any of us. And of course, it will encourage other players in the region to become nuclear as well in order to protect themselves. And again, that's bad news for all of us. Forget Israel. Our position from the very get-go was Iran is not just Israel's problem. It's true that we've been very vocal. And in fact, when you look at what Prime Minister Netanyahu did, and at the time, the Minister of Defense, Ehud Barak, I would argue as a humble diplomat, it's perhaps the biggest achievement in the history of Israeli foreign policy. The fact that they were able to single-handedly put the Iranian issue on the agenda. No one was discussing Iran's nuclear ambitions 8 years ago, 9 years ago. We talked about it behind closed doors. But it became a major issue. Sanctions were enforced, enacted. The world responded to it. Unfortunately, as far as Israel is concerned, we weren't able to change the situation where Iran will be able to enrich enough uranium for one bomb within 10, 15 years. We think it's a big problem for all of us. But again, Iran is not just Israel's problem.
To add a little spice into this conversation, though, the former defense minister today made some rather provocative remarks about the deal, suggesting that it had now basically removed an existential threat from Israel. Sorry.
Please repeat the question.
The question was, I wanted to throw a little provocation in the discussion. The former defense minister today made some comments about Iran that were, about the Iran deal, that were rather more positive than what Ambassador Aharoni has suggested. And he said that the deal had basically removed the existential threat to Israel, at least for the time being, while the deal is in force. So I wanted to know what the ambassador thought about that, and whether he thought he was right.
Look, I was 11 years old when the Yom Kippur War broke out, October of 1973. Israel was attacked simultaneously by Egypt and Syria. We were caught by surprise. We didn't have the luxury of losing that war, but we were on the verge of losing that war. And I remember very vividly the impact of this notion. Imagine, here you live in New York, you live in America. You don't go to sleep at night thinking maybe I won't have a nation tomorrow. It doesn't even cross your minds because America is such a huge country, such a powerful country, such a big, vast land. But in Israel, is a different mindset based on a very long history of persecution, based on a very long history of proven track record. This is not our imagination. Things happen to our people throughout history. So when we see a country, 65 million people with natural resources, that is determined to achieve nuclear military capabilities, lying about it, never telling the truth about it, we have all the reasons in the world to believe that the reason why they would like to acquire this nuclear capability is because one day they actually intend to use it. Now, they're not even making this a secret. All you have to do is listen to what they say and read what they write. So the question is, if a responsible leadership is going to say, you know what, they're not serious. We can't take them serious. They're what, are they crazy? We're going to attack them also. America will attack them. And that's, you know what, that's a legitimate thought. But you can't argue, I believe, that I'm not in a position to argue the other position that says we don't have the luxury of ignoring Iran's statements based on our history. And again, everybody says, you know what, historical comparisons sometimes are misleading, they're invalid, and they may even have a case. But I have to say that in the case of Iran, that is constantly attacking Israel by proxy, people tend to forget that. But Hezbollah is attacking Israel at Iran's request. There's no question about it. Iran is involved in attacking and agitating Israel all over the globe, and Jewish communities under threat by Iran all over the world. And so we know what we're dealing with. Look, 3 days after the agreement was reached, not 3 years after, 3 days after the agreement was reached, the leader of Iran said, it's okay for the Iranian people to chant death to America. And he explained why. He said, they are expressing their will. This is the will of the people. He said it. Now, you can say, okay, you can dismiss him and say, you know what, he said it because of his needs, his political needs, domestically, maybe, I don't know. But again, I don't think that we have the luxury of ignoring that. Now, what former Minister of Defense said is that for now, the program is delayed, and that's a good thing. When he referred to the question of existential threat, I think he was referring more to the fact that the Syrian army is now disintegrating in front of our eyes. The Iraqi army has bigger fish to fry. When you look at all of our neighbors, Egypt is becoming a strategic ally of Israel because of the rise of ISIS, because of what's happening with the Iran nuclear deal. Same thing goes for Saudi Arabia. There's a new regional configuration, and that, I think, cannot be disputed. The Iran deal also created a new alliance in the Middle East. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves, just like at the eve of the first Gulf War in January of 1991, we find ourselves on the same side, in the same boat, with some other Arab countries that are as concerned as Israel with Iran's nuclear and regional ambitions.
So could we conclude then that the deal actually has had a very beneficial effect on Israel's security?
Short term, no question that it's a good thing that Iran will be unable to produce enough enriched uranium for a bomb tomorrow. There's no question about that. That's a good thing. But we are also concerned with the long-term impact. Are we going to address the motivation of the regime? And philosophically, this is really the difference between Israel and some other countries. We are primarily concerned with the motivation of our enemy. Whether they will have this weapon or the other weapon is less important. What's more important is what they believe in, and we need to address that as well.
So this idea of the Sunni Arabs coming into, if not an alliance, at least a coordination, or not a coordination, but a like-mindedness with Israel. How far do you think that can go? As you all look at Iran in very similar ways, what do you think the potential is for coordination, cooperation among the Arabs and Israel for a new security order in the region?
Well, let me begin by saying that we think what's happening now is it's very sad. We see what's happening in Syria. Close to 400,000 people dead. 2.5 to 3 million new refugees that are threatening the stability of all of Syria's neighbors. We are very concerned with events in the Middle East. Look, there are 6 or 7 members of the Arab League today that meet the criteria of what we define as a failed state. A failed state is a state that cannot provide the basic needs for its citizens. So these are bad news, not just for the peoples of the Middle East. These are bad news for all of us. And of course, we're not happy about it. We're not happy that our neighbors are suffering. Having said that, several things happen that will impact, as you said correctly, the future. The first thing that happened is that following this regional wave of instability, it became clear to many people, especially in the intellectual circles and policy-making circles, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that was previously considered to be the root cause for all instability in the Middle East is not the only issue on the agenda. There are many other active, national, tribal, ethnic, religious conflicts in the Middle East. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of them. Now, this is not to say that it's not important to resolve the conflict. It's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that we have to put things in perspective. And right now, leaders throughout the Arab and the Muslim world have bigger fish to fry. So that's the first thing that is happening. Second thing, as you correctly said, there are new alliances. And those new alliances represent a great deal of opportunity. Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke about it a few days ago. He said, I see the opportunity as well. The question is, how do you achieve progress? Well, without compromising your security needs. Because again, we have to remember that everything that we do has a consequence. So we pulled out of Gaza unilaterally. We fulfilled the so-called Palestinian territorial fantasy. And then, and by the way, until the last square inch, all of Gaza was given to them. And what happened in return? What happened as a result? Of course, a barrage of thousands of rockets and missiles. And again, this is something that no other society would tolerate. Not in America, not in Europe. No society would tolerate thousands of rockets from an area that you just left. And so we have to remember that everything has a consequence. So the Israeli government will look at the situation, will weigh the options, and I'm sure they'll make the best decision for Israel's security. But I agree with you that there are new opportunities in abundance in the Middle East. For example, I don't see any reason why Israel shouldn't have diplomatic relations one day with Iraq, post-Saddam, or with Libya, post-Gaddafi, or even with Lebanon if Hezbollah is taken out of the picture. I don't see why Israel shouldn't have diplomatic relations one day with other Arab countries that are like-minded, that are also interested in regional stability and regional peace.
What's it going to take, though, to put those relationships out in public and have real movement? Because we know that there are private discussions, mostly private discussions going on now. What will it take to actually push it in a more public and productive, maybe, direction?
Well, you know, if you look at the history of Israeli policy making from David Ben-Gurion all the way to Netanyahu, you'll always see that Israelis were always very open about their foreign policy goals. It was always about making peace, building bridges. Israel is known for complying with agreements signed. We signed the peace treaty with Egypt that required us to leave the Sinai, and we did that. We signed the peace treaty with Jordan that required us to transfer land in the Jordan Valley. We did that as well. We pulled out of Gaza unilaterally. We pulled out of Lebanon. So those are policies that were declared in advance by Israeli leaders and were implemented by Israeli leaders. So we have a very long track record of really explicitly expressing, our desire to make peace with our neighbors, even after they attacked us. Let me remind all of us that it was Egypt that tried to eliminate Israel in 1973. And they lost the war, and Israel, several years later, entered negotiations with Egypt, a country that just tried to eliminate us. And I think it's pretty unprecedented when you look at the way countries behave. So Zionism, from its very inception, was all about building and not destroying, was all about extending our hand in peace, building bridges with our neighbors. Unfortunately, this narrative was hijacked quite aggressively and brutally by our opponents.
I'm going to ask one more question and then open up to all of you, because I hope you have a lot of interesting things to ask the ambassador. One of the last big items on the agenda between the United States and Israel these days is a new 10-year defense agreement. Do you think, what are the chances that's going to get closed before Obama leaves office? And what can you say about the nature of the disputes still ongoing?
I don't think there's a dispute. I think that the United States, under President Obama, has been very committed to Israel's security. President Obama said time and again that the bond between Israel is unbreakable and unshakable, and I can tell you with a great deal of authority that the relationship has been incredibly, incredibly solid in terms of the magnitude and the depth and the military aid and beyond military aid. Talking about the incredible system that was developed by Israel called Iron Dome that allowed us to intercept rockets simultaneously and protect the Israeli South. We had 60% of our population under rocket threat for 52 days. My wife is here with me. She was in a bomb shelter for many days in the summer of 2014 with our kids in Israel. And this Iron Dome system, which is really one of the wonders of military technology, we could not have developed the Iron Dome system without your help. And every Israeli is grateful for the US administration, for President Obama, for the legislators in Washington, D.C., and for the American people for helping us with this project and many other projects. So, I don't think it's going to be a problem. I think that they'll negotiate. I don't see the dispute. Maybe they will negotiate the details, but I think there's an agreement that Israel should always maintain what we call the competitive edge. We don't have the luxury of losing our military competitive edge, our technological competitive edge, and I think there's a great deal of understanding here in the United States that it's for the good of all of us that Israel remains strong and able to protect itself.
So is there agreement on the amount of missile defense money that will be in this agreement?
Well, I'm not part of the negotiation, so I can't share with you. I know this is your journalistic DNA now, but I wish I had an answer for you. I'm not part of those negotiations. I'm just, your humble servant here in New York.
No, nobody's whispering in your ear, huh?
No.
Okay, sir.
I know you're not happy with the Iranian agreement. What would you have suggested that we do? Agreements require both sides to agree to something.
Right. So, thank you for the question. Look, we said it all along that we believe that what the West should have done is continue with the combined effort. On the one hand, sanctions, real sanctions, and on the other hand, the presence of a real credible military threat was critical. The only time in the past where the Iranians voluntarily, by the way, stopped their nuclear program was when they were convinced, following the demise of Saddam Hussein, that they're going to be next in line. And to us, it means that the Iranians understand that the combination of the presence of a real credible military threat on the table combined with sanctions, real sanctions, and the world had them already. When you're deprived of your ability to perform international monetary transactions through the SWIFT system, those of you in banking, then that's a real sanction. This is something very, it suffocates one's economy. So Iran was on the verge of getting the message that you have to stop your program if you don't want to completely destroy your economy. And then, unfortunately, the West gave them a hand. And
The question is why? Why did the West pursue this course?
I can only speculate, okay, let me give you an example from the field of education or the field of therapy. So you have a kid in the class who's the classroom bully, all right? And there are two approaches educationally how to deal with this kid. One approach says, when you have a bully in the classroom and you're the teacher, you have to sanction the kid. You have to punish that kid. And the other approach says, you know what? Punishment will get you nowhere. We need to embrace the kid. If he's irresponsible, if he's not accountable for his actions, let's give him responsibility. That's the way to educate him. That's the way to bring him back into the family of nation. Now, I would agree with the second option on any given day, with any student in the classroom, with the exception of one student, Iran. It's the wrong student to embrace. Believe me, with Iran, there's only one. I say this because I've been in diplomacy for 25 years. And the damage that Iran inflicted on the world is incredible. Incredible. In Latin America, in Central Asia. Ask our friends in Azerbaijan, the second largest Shiite country in the world. They'll tell you. Ask people throughout the region. Iran is the foremost promoter and producer of terrorism in the world. It's a rogue regime that is executing 2,800 of its own people every year with no trial, that is openly denying the Holocaust, is hosting Holocaust denial conferences every year in Tehran. We're talking about a nation that doesn't play by our rules. And so the question that we ask the world is, okay, you want to embrace them? So many times before we've seen this happen. And so there's no question, by the way, and I don't think there's philosophically a disagreement on this issue, that the main problem in our region is lack of accountability, lack of self-criticism. It's a cultural thing. You will be hard-pressed to find self-critical op-ed pieces in Arab and Muslim press. It doesn't happen so often. And there's no question about that. In terms of how we diagnose the problem, we all agree. The problem is lack of accountability, lack of self-reflection, lack of self-criticism, and as a result, lack of progress, lack of knowledge. They're not producing new knowledge, unfortunately. And our issue was never with the Iranian people. Please don't make that mistake. We have no issue with the Iranian people whatsoever. Our issue from the get-go was with this particular regime. Let me remind you that Israel was heavily involved with building the current infrastructure in Iran during the times of the Shah. Israeli companies built highways and bridges in Iran. We were involved with energy during the times of the Shah. And we know that the Iranian people is highly educated, and we know that they're highly capable. And there's a great deal of appreciation in Israel for the Iranian people. And we have a strong Iranian Jewish community in Israel, in New York, in Los Angeles, in Toronto, in Paris. And so we know all of that. But the problem that we have is with the decision to embrace this particular regime and to hope that they will respond positively. I don't think it's going to be a wild guess on my part to predict that this experiment is not going to succeed. I'm sad to say that. I wish I'd be wrong.
Why have we done such a lousy job in PR here? Why do we have Jewish students in our major universities facing anti-Semitism? Why do we have the Palestinian cause, through a wonderful newspaper, highlighted that the problem is the territories, that the problem is the settlements, that the students are being harassed on the universities, the wonderful professors are in favor of BDS. Where have we dropped the ball?
Okay, it's a fair question. Did you all hear the question?
No.
Okay, it was a rather lengthy question, so I'll just sum it up. Why have we failed, right? Allowing the other side to hijack the narrative, basically, that's what you're saying. Okay, so if I may share with you my view. You know, I've been in the North American arena for only 25 years. Went to school here, went to Emerson College during the high days of the first Intifada from 1988. I served in Los Angeles from 94 to 98. I served in New York from 2001 to 2005. Came here several months before 9/11. And then again as Consul General from 2010 to 2016. During those years, I lectured in hundreds of universities, met with thousands of students and hundreds of faculty members and administrators. And I think I have a pretty good understanding of the problem. And first of all, we should not look at the problem as a crisis. It's not a crisis. No, it's not a crisis. It's a deeper problem that runs much deeper and begins with the intellectual discourse. Let me explain. And I will try to explain the emergence of this new narrative, because if you think it's about Israel, I'd like to put it in a different perspective, all right? Post-Cold War, post-World War II, and certainly post-Cold War, a new narrative emerged, what we call the narrative that looks and, we call it the anti-colonialist, postmodernist narrative, okay? According to this narrative, if you are being oppressed anywhere in the world, you have the right to oppose this perceived or real oppression. And according to this narrative, just as Europe has ended its colonialist chapter in Algiers in the mid-60s, Israel was beginning its colonialist chapter in the territories. According to this narrative, which is the narrative of our opponents, of Israel's detractors, Israel is a result of the Holocaust. This narrative is ignoring tens of years of nation building in Palestine before the Holocaust. I remind you here that the Jews in Palestine, my family came in 1870 to Jerusalem. My mother's family, her parents came from Yemen in 1913, many, many years before statehood. And the Jews of Palestine, the first higher learning institution that they established was a school of art, 1906, in Jerusalem, Beth Hallel. Only 3 years later, they established their first military organization, HaShomer, in 1909, the year Tel Aviv was established. They were not there to kill people. They were not even there to build military presence. Their first act as a collective was a school of art. All right? This is 1906. And so the narrative says that the world, especially Europe, because of its guilt, decided to give Eastern European newcomers land in Palestine at the expense of the poor indigenous Palestinians. Now you add to that the new postmodernist conversation about everything is relative. We have to understand, who am I to judge the Palestinians? They are the oppressed. And therefore, they have the legitimate right to oppose the oppression. And if their way to do it is by attacking innocent people, who am I to judge that? Right? That's what they say. They say it on campus. This is not my imagination. This is in the textbooks. These are the academic texts that are being produced all over the world. By the way, in some universities in Israel as well. And then you have the intersectionality. All the oppressed...
Who's producing these textbooks?
Intellectuals, I'm talking about now. If you think it's about Israel, let me tell you. What I just described to you, in the first place, is anti-Western. Then it's anti-American, and only then it's against Israel. Now, it's true that there's some people on the fringe that make a lot of noise, and they say Israel is the source of all the problems. Okay, let them say it. The problem that we have is not them. The problem is what Carol said before, that for the uninformed or / uninterested, This narrative is a major turnoff. The very debate is a major turnoff. So what you see on campus is not people that do not support. The question is not a question of support, as I said before. The question is, am I attracted to this conversation? So even good people, Jews and non-Jews alike, they say, you know what do I need this headache for? Who's right and who's wrong? It's not for me. I take two steps back, and I call this disconnect. And the disconnect is the biggest problem that we have. We have great programs like Birthright and Masa and BBYO and Lapid and all those great programs that take young people to see Israel for themselves. Just experience the place, have a relationship with the place. You know, Israelis, let me tell you something you don't know. How many Israelis enter the United States through New York every year? 500,000. For a nation of 8.5 million people, it's pretty incredible. 500,000 Israelis enter the United States every year, most of them through New York. Now, New York has a special place in the heart of every Israeli. Every Israeli has a special relationship with New York. It has nothing to do with what we think about the policies of the people that run the city. It has nothing to do with what we think with the policies of other people in the country. We have a relationship with New York that is independent of politics. That's what we need to do on campus. That's what we need to do with those academics. They are entitled to have their opinion. But you can't take seriously an academic, and I will not mention her name, who's openly gay, happens to be Jewish, who is siding with Hezbollah, firing rockets on innocent Israelis, in the name of their right to oppose the occupation. And mind you, there's no occupation in Lebanon. Israel left Lebanon in May of 2000, according to UN Resolution 425. Completely complied to the letter with the resolution. And then you ask yourself, what is going to happen to this woman, this openly gay woman, this academic, if she would go to spend the weekend with Hezbollah in Lebanon as an opinionated feminist? What would happen to her? Does she realize what would happen to her? And this intersectionality, this unholy alliance, doesn't make any sense. But in today's world, and I urge all of you to read this beautiful piece that was published in The Atlantic a few months ago called The Cuddling of the American Mind. It's a brilliant analysis of the situation today on campus. It's not just about Israel. It's not just about Israel. Israel stands to suffer from it because of our particular situation. We are in a certain configuration right now. But it's not about Israel. Let us not make that mistake. It's a much larger issue. It's a strong movement within the academic world. And there's a way to deal with it. And the way to deal with it is simply embrace those people, have them come to Israel and see Israel for themselves. I was personally accused because I was like the architect of Israel's relationship with the gay community. I had nothing to do with it, by the way. And I was accused of pinkwashing. Oh, you're bragging about Israel's relationship with the gay community because it's pinkwashing. You are trying to divert our attention from the real issue, which is the oppression of the Palestinians. And my answer to these people is, you know what? There's nothing to wash. Come to Israel and see for yourself. There's no censorship. Just come to Israel and see what's happening with the gay community or any other community in Israel. Now, of course, we're not perfect. We have many issues. But I'm urging all of us, and this has been my philosophy, don't judge Israel or don't judge New York by its imperfections. Judge Israel or judge New York by its attempt to fix them.
I'm going to push back just a little bit on that.
All right.
Do you not think that the policies of the government, the fact that there's no peace process, that the settlements are continuing to expand, and that the chances of an actual Palestinian state fade with each day, and this is not only my opinion, but the opinion of many scholars and many ex-intelligence and ex-defense people in Israel. You know, isn't that a big part of what's causing a lot of this ferment?
Well, again, depends on how you want to analyze what happened. Here's the question that most Israelis ask themselves. And make no mistake, most Israelis support the two-state solution, including the current government. This is the 5th government. The last 5 Israeli governments, just as the last 4 presidential administrations in the United States, support the two-state solution. It's their official policy. Up until the summer of the year 2000, most Israelis believed that the issue at hand is territorial. And really the core problem was land. And there was also the notion of territorial compromise that said basically, you know what? You give them what they want, land, they'll give you what you want, peace and security. And then something very dramatic happened. President Bill Clinton in the summer of the year 2000 convened Israelis and Palestinians and said, look, here's a deal. 98% of the land will go to the Palestinians. The remainder, by the way, in the land swap in the south, in the desert. And that's my deal. He called it the Clinton plan. Israel's prime minister, I don't have to tell you, Ehud Barak said yes. Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinians at the time, said no. Not only that he said no, he immediately waged war shortly thereafter against Israeli civilians. Let me remind you that 75% of the people that were injured or killed during the Second Intifada were civilians. This was not a war against Israeli soldiers or against Israeli police officers. They were targeting people like yourselves. Then, something else happened. In 2005, Ariel Sharon, of all people, decides to pull out of Gaza. Again, fulfilling, as I said before, the Palestinian territorial fantasy. What happened? Rockets. And then the most amazing thing happened. In 2008, according to Condoleezza Rice, Israel's prime minister at the time, Ehud Olmert, is proposing to the Palestinian leader 100% of the territories. And he says to him, let me get back to you. And we never hear from him again. Then, a few years later, now Netanyahu is the prime minister. He's being approached by the international community. Say, look, the Palestinians say that if you will put a freeze on settlements, which is something that was never done before, not by Rabin, not by Peres, not by Barak, if you will put a freeze on settlements, then they will be willing to resume negotiations. And there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Netanyahu said, okay, you know, it's going to be difficult because of the structure of my coalition, the composition of my coalition, but you know what? We'll make that happen. He said 9 months freeze to jumpstart the negotiations. And he did for 10 months. Then what happened? The Palestinians said, you know what? If you will not prolong the freeze, we will not resume negotiations. They said, okay. The bottom line is that today there's a very peculiar situation in Israel where most Israelis support the two-state solution. But if you ask them, do you think it's going to work? Most Israelis are very skeptical. Why? Because the Palestinians did everything within their power to convince us, the Israelis, that the conflict is not about land. They did whatever they could to convince us, the Israelis, who really want peace. As I said before, Betzalel was the first creation. School of art. Who's building a school of art? And so today, the problem that we have is that most Israelis are convinced, because the Palestinians convinced them, that the conflict is not about land, but rather about our very right to exist. So in other words, the unfinished business between Israelis and Palestinians is not 1967, but rather 1948. And that requires an entire different approach. If the issue at hand is existential, then you need an entirely different approach. And I think that's what you see now in Israel. So it's not that the Israelis don't want peace. Of course, if peace will strike tomorrow, I'll be the happiest person because it will make my life easier. Everybody will be happy. The economy will do much better. Tourism will be, everything is going to be great. But we can't ignore the responsibility of the other side to the current situation. You know, take Arafat. Why did he have to say no? He could have said, you know, if I had to be his advisor, I would have said, you know, Arafat, say yes, but. Say yes, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reservations. Why did you have to say no? And after you said no, why did you have to attack innocent Israelis? 1,400 people lost their lives during the Second Intifada, men, women, and children. And of course, after that, it's going to be very, very difficult. It's a monumental task to convince the Israelis that the conflict is not existential.
Let's take this woman right here. Sorry.
I agree with what you said 1,000%, that in order to understand the situation in Israel, you have to go and see for yourself. I am, and I've always been a staunch supporter of Israel. My father was born in Jerusalem, he's buried there. I've been there many, many times. And I always, with respect to the Arab-Israeli conflict, my attitude was Israel could do no wrong and the Arabs could do no right. 3 months ago, I spent 7 days in Israel, meeting with Israeli and Palestinian members of Combatants for Peace, an organization of former IDF members and former members of Fatah and Hamas, who are working together and are committed to bringing about, through peaceful means, a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was eye-opening and disturbing. They came away with the firm conviction that the hope for the future sustainability of Israel as an independent Jewish democratic society rests with the success of groups such as this. My question is, what are you and the Israeli government doing to ensure the success of such grassroots movements who are committed to bringing about change through peaceful means?
All right, those of you who didn't hear the question was, you didn't hear the question? Question was what Israel is doing in order to promote grassroots peaceful coexistence programs, right? So there are many, many initiatives. I'm not familiar with any of them. For example, I'm not familiar with the initiative that you mentioned, but I can tell you that great things are happening along the Israeli-Palestinian interface, from joint investments in high tech in the territories, all the way to youth groups that spend time together in summer camps and so on. There are many, many NGOs in Israel, and most notably the Paris Center for Peace, as well as other organizations, Seeds for Peace and so on, that work diligently day in and day out to promote peaceful coexistence. At the end of the day, we have to remember, it's true that we are facing terrorism. It's true that there's right now a renewed wave of knifings and stabbings that is of concern to us, and every Israeli is concerned about that. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the fact that there are very, very good things that are happening on the ground. And there are businesses being built, there are tremendous partnerships that are being formed, and one must not ignore that.
If I could just follow up for a second. With respect to these grassroots movement, and these are the people who ultimately have to accept any sort of peace accord. These people are working together and trying and conducting peaceful demonstrations, and yet the Israeli government is taking actions against them, military actions, where there was a demonstration on April 8th, and the Israeli government used rubber bullets against Israelis and Palestinians who wanted to plant an olive tree in demonstration that we're looking for peace and to try and make a statement. There was nothing confrontational about it. How can Israel justify taking these kind of actions against these groups when these are the very people that they need to support and encourage in order to expand the base of Palestinians that will work with Israel?
Well, you're asking me about an incident I'm not familiar with. All I can tell you is that there are very few military forces in the world or governments in the world that have a record like ours of self-criticism and self-inspection. So if there was any wrongdoing, I'm sure that it will be investigated by the Israeli authorities. If you have further information about this incident, I'd love for you to give us all the information that you have, and we will look into it.
I'd love to speak to you after.
Please.
Two more questions.
Yeah, okay. The gentleman right here. please.
Did any Syrian refugees try to get to Israel?
Well, the situation with Syrian refugees is very complicated because we are in a state of war with Syria. Syria is a hostile nation to Israel. Having said that, we are doing everything we can in order to help people who need our help. And so I think it was even reported in the New York Times. We opened a field hospital on the Golan Heights that is providing much needed medical help to people, Syrian refugees, people that were injured. And we tried to do our best to take care of them. The more severe cases are being transferred to the city of Nahariya, which is about an hour and a half west of the Golan Heights. And, you know, and we're trying to do everything we can. We try to provide water to the refugee camps in Jordan. We try to help NGOs to facilitate their great work. But that's the extent of what we can do at this point.
Last question, over here.
How much do you think the BDS movement will affect Israel?
I was asked about how much do I think the people that call for boycott will affect Israel. As I said before, the problem is not a boycott. Israel is not being boycotted at all. In fact, Israel's performance economically, culturally, has never been better. The problem is the narrative. The problem is how people that really don't have the background, don't have the knowledge, how are they going to respond to the narrative that says, look, you know, Moshe Dayan, our legendary Minister of Defense, always used to say that when you look at the two guys fighting, it's very difficult to convince the spectators that the guy who's holding the baseball bat is the nice guy of the two. In other words, just by the fact that we have the military might, the size, the economic strength, just by that fact, the Palestinians are being viewed as the underdog. And there are many people in the world that have a tendency, it's a natural tendency, to sympathize with the underdog. We understand that. But the problem that we have is not boycott. Let me just tell you this. 1945 was the year when the Arab League decided to enforce the Arab economic boycott against the Jewish settlement in Palestine. This was 3 years before statehood. And this boycott was a real boycott. Had a supervising mechanism that was based in Damascus. Governments complied with it. International corporations complied with it. It then coincided with the Cold War, so it became part of the West-East tension. And we were really isolated economically and also culturally. Our sporting teams could not compete in Asia. Now, this was supposed to be a huge curse, but it actually turned out to be a great blessing. Why? Because it forced Israel to develop new markets in Europe, in North America, in Asia. Today, Israel's #1 trade partner is the European Union. Still. You know, things happen sometimes, you know, the theory of unintended consequence. They wanted to suffocate Israeli economy. Instead, they served as a catalyst for an incredible growth. So what you're looking at right now is not a boycott. Israel is not being boycotted. On the contrary, every day I read in the paper another major international star is coming to perform in Israel. Only yesterday I saw that Beyonce is coming again to Israel. Louis C.K. is coming to Israel. Believe me, if Louis C.K. is coming to Israel, you're not being boycotted. There's no way. Louis C.K. is coming to perform in Israel. And so the question at hand is not one of boycott. It's the delegitimization that bothers me. That people disguise their, you know, double standard. You know, we all talk about anti-Semitism. Maybe we'll conclude with that. What is your definition of anti-Semitism? To me, the definition is very simple. Double standard. Unfair double standard. If you say every person is allowed to walk into this hotel, but Jews are not allowed, that's anti-Semitism. If you say every person is allowed to board this bus, but blacks are not allowed to board this bus, that's racism. That's very clear. So when people say to me, academics in this country, every place in the world has the right to celebrate its assets, including your relationship with the gay community, or including your relationship with the artistic, whatever it is you want to celebrate. Every place has that right. Even North Korea and Iran has that right. But you don't because of the Palestinians. I say that's anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism. That's a double standard. Because if Iran and North Korea are allowed to celebrate their achievements, if the United Nations is passing 26 anti-Israel resolutions and not even one about the what's happening in Darfur, then you must ask yourself, what's going on here? There must be something wrong in this lack of balance. And so this is really what, now the solution, and I will end with that, the solution is really to engage in a much broader, inclusive conversation about Israel, so that every person, your friends from that organization as well as others, will find their place. And it's okay to be critical of Israel. Most Israelis are critical of Israel. Thank you so much.
With that.